Time for me to talk about day 2 of the 2012 NFL Draft. Maybe see what teams that did well on day 1 continue to do so into the draft second day, and maybe see if the teams that didn't do so hot on day 1 rectified their mistakes on day 2. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the best and worst picks in day number 2, and then talk about the biggest winners and losers on day number 2 of the NFL Draft, and one team in particular will feel my wrath. Some of the best picks on day number 2, let's look at the Indianapolis Colts, taking tight ends in both the second and third round, with Colby Fleener from Stanford going number 34. What better way to provide a security blanket for a young franchise quarterback than a playmaking tight end? And not only a playmaking tight end, but one that has chemistry with Luck, as they played together for 3 years at Stanford. And then following that up with another weapon at tight end in Dwayne Allen in the third round at pick number 64. So a good second day for the Indianapolis Colts, to be sure. Courtney Upshaw going number 35 to the Baltimore Ravens, and then them coming back at pick 84 and taking Bernard Pierce in the third round, the running back from Temple. Courtney Upshaw had a first-round grade. He's going to be somebody that could really generate a pass rush on the outside and maybe even on the inside in Baltimore's 3-4 scheme. And they got him at pick number 35, a guy that was projected to go anywhere between maybe 16 and 26. So great value there. And getting Bernard Pierce from Temple, a legitimate power backup to Ray Rice, and with Ray Rice's contract situation with the Ravens, may be able potentially to come in and start from day 1 if the Ravens really needed him to. A great value pick again towards the end of round 3. The St. Louis Rams did well for themselves by taking Janoris Jenkins, the corner from North Alabama, at pick number 39, and then following that up in the third round by taking Tremaine Johnson, who I project to play free safety at the NFL level from Montana. The Rams secondary was boo-boo. Absolute boo-boo over the past couple of seasons. So Jeff Fisher knew that had to be addressed. And not only did it get addressed, you got a guy in Janoris Jenkins at pick number 35. Yes, he had character concerns, but those were the concerns about him. Everything else about his skill set says he was a top 10 or 15 player in this draft. And I believe Janoris Jenkins could potentially, if he stays out of trouble, end up being the very best cover corner out of this entire draft. And then getting a guy like Tremaine Johnson, again, some character concerns, but the talent is absolutely there. Big size, decent speed, could be a real playmaking, ball-hawking free safety for Jeff Fisher and that Rams defense. The Atlanta Falcons getting Peter Kahns at number 55. Anytime you can get a first-round pick dropped to you at pick 55, and it's going to be an anchor, the centerpiece of your offensive line for the next decade plus, you have to say to yourself, job well done. So it's almost like the Atlanta Falcons, who did not have a first-round pick in this year's draft because of the Julio Jones trade last year, still ended up with one and only have to pay 55th overall pick money to Peter Kahns. Great job. The New York Giants getting Ruben Randall at pick number 64, the last pick of the second round. They lost Mario Manningham in free agency. Now you get a guy that for some people carried a late first, early second round grade on him, and you get him all the way at the end of round 2. Again, that's how the draft is done. Sometimes you move up, sometimes you move down, and sometimes you keep your ass put and you wait and see what drops to you. I also really liked the Cincinnati Bengals selection, in particular in the third round, of taking Mohamed Sanu, the wide receiver from Rutgers. They already have A.J. Green on one side, a legit number 1. You need more weapons, though, for your young quarterback, Andy Dalton. Sanu could come in and be a great complementary piece to A.J. Green in that Bengals passing attack. Now for just some of the dumbest or most mind-blowing picks of day number 2. Looking at the Cleveland Browns, I thought they had a solid first day of the draft. And then they came back in the second round when both Cordy Glenn and Jonathan Martin, who to me were both better offensive line prospects, were still on the board. Stephen Hill, a wide receiver that they desperately needed, was still on the board. They chose to take Mitchell Schwartz, the offensive tackle from California. Sure, maybe he can play right away on the right side. But was that really the best value you could get for that pick? That's what I asked the Cleveland Browns. The Detroit Lions taking Ryan Broyles at pick number 54. Hey, when you have Matthew Stafford, there's nothing wrong with giving him as many weapons as possible. My concern is Ryan Broyles is an Oklahoma wide receiver, and in recent years, they really have not enjoyed much success in the NFL. Furthermore, he is coming off of a big knee injury. and you take him at pick 54 when a lot of other indications are that he should have been maybe a 4th or 5th round pick, it was a bit of a reach. Nothing wrong with the position they addressed in the 2nd round, but the pick, there's just no reason to take him that high for the Detroit Lions. Brock Osweiler going number 57 to the Denver Broncos. It wasn't head-scratching that they took a young quarterback early because they needed some insurance, if Peyton Manning got hurt again since they traded away Tim Tebow. So they took Osweiler. Now my question is to the Denver Broncos. You ended up coming back early in the 3rd round and taking Ronnie Hillman from San Diego State. Wouldn't it have been better to take a much, much better version of Ronnie Hillman and what he does in LaMichael James, who went to the Niners at pick 61? Wouldn't it have been better to take him at pick 57 and maybe hope that Brock Osweiler would be there at the beginning of the 3rd round? Because now you've spent a high pick, if you're the Denver Broncos, a high pick on a guy that isn't going to play potentially for several seasons. And ultimately, as important as building up the defense was in Denver, they needed to work on their offense too. You just brought in Peyton Manning. You need to surround him with as many weapons as you possibly can. And they just did not do that on day 2 of the draft. And also the Bears. You take a safety with a 6th round grade in round 3 that didn't even play in 2011. Need I say any more? You can like a guy, and sometimes it's okay to reach a little. But when you reach 2, 3, 4 rounds, that's just too much. And especially with the number of mid-round picks the Chicago Bears have spent on this position in recent years. Why am I, as a Bears fan, to believe that this guy is going to be different than any of the other ones? Maybe the worst pick of the 2nd day of the draft was Akiem Hicks, the defensive tackle from Regina in Canada, going to the New Orleans Saints at pick 89. This was the Saints' first pick in the draft, and they took a project who has nice tools and could potentially develop into something, but with all the impending suspensions from Bountygate, especially on the defensive side of the ball, you would think the New Orleans Saints' priority is getting good value, but also getting somebody who could contribute potentially in an important role right away. I just did not understand the logic of taking Hicks there when, again, he probably would have been there a couple of rounds later. Now I'm going to take a look at the teams that I consider winners on day 2 of this year's draft. We'll start with the Indianapolis Colts. What better way to ensure that the Andrew Luck era gets off to a flying start than to surround him with numerous weapons on offense? They did that by taking a pair of tight ends in Fleener and Dwayne Allen, and then taking T.Y. Hilton in the 3rd round, a guy who could contribute out of the slot and also help your offense out in the return game. I thought the Indianapolis Colts couldn't have done much better on day number 2, quite frankly. The Baltimore Ravens, by sitting there and taking 2 guys that could come in and contribute right away, and also getting good value, getting a 1st-round pick in Courtney Upshaw to drop to them at pick 35, and then taking Bernard Pierce, the running back from Temple, at pick 84, I thought that's just an example of taking the best player available, and they happen to fit a position of need. The St. Louis Rams. I like Brian Quick, but maybe he went a little high. But if they think he could develop into a Terrell Owens type of wide receiver, they won't worry about where they took him 5 years from now. But taking Janoris Jenkins, and then following that up and taking Trumaine Johnson, and being able to get them where they did, and in particular Janoris Jenkins, who I think could end up being a top 10 player out of this entire draft, you have to consider it job well done. And they even addressed depth at running back with Isaiah Pead from Cincinnati. Even though I'm not the biggest fan, at least they addressed a position of need. And then the Cincinnati Bengals, by being able to get Devin Still in the 2nd round, and then following that up in the 3rd round with 2 more really solid value selections in Mohamed Sanu, the wide receiver from Rutgers, and Brandon Thompson, the defensive tackle from Clemson. You have to look at it and say the Cincinnati Bengals did a lot, not only to address needs, but getting good value at the spots that they took these guys. And that's how the draft should be done. Maybe they should send a memo to some of the draft's biggest losers on day 2. Now that I've talked about some of the biggest winners from day 2 of the draft, let's shift gears and focus on the biggest losers from day 2. The Cleveland Browns. It was disappointing because I thought in Trent Richardson and Brandon Weeden that they had gotten good value with those picks and taken also players that happen to fill big positions of need for the organization. But to take Mitchell Schwartz in particular in the second round, when guys like Stephen Hill, Cordy Glenn, and Jonathan Martin were either A, better players at the position of need, or B, better players, period, to me in the case of Stephen Hill. Taking Mitchell Schwartz, I just didn't get it. And then in the third round, taking the other Cincinnati defensive tackle, John Hughes, when Brandon Thompson's still on the board, I don't know about that. That's a bit of a reach again. Speaking of reaching for Cincinnati defensive tackles, the Denver Broncos. You know, all this talk on day one of the draft, they traded out of day one because they're ready to own day two. Well, taking Derek Wolfe from Cincinnati that high in the second round, you ain't owning shit. I'm not saying the guy can't play, but again, understand not only were you grade a prospect, but just as importantly, sometimes were other teams grade a prospect. If nobody has him ranked higher than a 4th or 5th round pick, why in the blue fuck would you take a guy that high in the second round, especially when guys such as Jarrell Worthy and Devin Still are better players and still on the board? Taking Brock Osweiler at 57 and following that up early in the third round by trading up to get Ronnie Hillman. You probably still could have ended up with Osweiler early in the third round and taken LaMichael James at pick 57 and ended up with, to me, a much better football player. So the Denver Broncos, instead of doing all they could to surround Peyton Manning with as many weapons as possible, were reaching for needs all over the place and taking the wrong players, in my opinion. The Miami Dolphins, after doing the right thing and taking Tannehill on Thursday night, Friday, I just didn't like their draft very much. Period. Taking Jonathan Martin, I like Jonathan Martin, but what, are you going to wait and get rid of Jake Long maybe at the end of the season and move Jonathan Martin over to left tackle? I don't think that's a wise decision to take a second-round guy and replace a guy that's a Pro Bowl caliber left tackle that you once took number 1 overall in the draft. And their pick of tight end in the third round, when there were receivers such as Mohamed Sanu, that were better players and filled just as big of a position of need, if not bigger, I don't really get it. And ultimately, the biggest losers of day number 2, just like to me they were in day number 1, has to be the Chicago Bears. Once Stephen Hill was on the board around pick 40 or so, Chicago, and you knew Stephen Hill was your guy because he provided a better complement of skills to Brandon Marshall on the outside than Alshon Jeffrey did, who's very similar in some ways to Marshall. Why in the fuck would you allow the New York Jets to trade up to get Stephen Hill to where you have to trade up to get Alshon Jeffrey? Was Alshon Jeffrey really that much of a better football player where you couldn't have just stayed at pick 50 or 51, whatever it was, and just taken Ruben Randall? I'm just saying. I thought Ruben Randall was a better receiver. I think Mohamed Sanu is a better wide receiver than Alshon Jeffrey. Take one of those guys. Stay put in the second round. And don't even get me started on the third round pick. Yet another fucking safety. This time a guy that didn't even play in 2011. Sure, he's 6'3", 210 pounds, and could potentially provide a physical in-box presence that their defense does need. But how many times, Chicago, do you have to take the same fucking position in the same area of the draft and it still doesn't work before you realize you need to go barking up a different tree? Not to mention the fact that this guy was pretty much graded out as a 6th round pick and you took him in the 3rd round? So you either were drafting for need and took the wrong players, or you're telling me that you thought Brandon Harden was one of the top 100 players in this draft. And if you think that, Phil Emery in Chicago Bears organization, then I really wonder what the hell you know about the NFL draft process. Fucking ridiculous. Easily, to me, the biggest losers of day number 2, just like they were on day number 1.